I'm turning on the recording if you don't mind. There's other ways to learn the law. You open the code of law, you get the law. You open Maimonides, you get the law. So if you're just studying for the law, then it's not necessarily the most efficient. When we study Talmud, we're really looking for the process of analyzing, how to get to the conclusion, what are the conflicting values that we want to balance, and the process of analysis. And the understanding is that if you get the background, the back and forth and the discussion, then you will have a deeper understanding of the law, because you'll know when what cases the law is applicable and when to apply it and when not to apply it. So it's not so there's the law. We want, on one hand, we want to know what to do, but on the other hand, we're also keeping our attention at the analysis in general. Okay, with that introduction, we talk about what's the specific sugya, the specific topic. So in general, the law is into right and wrong, right? In American law or secular law or common law, you think about the law as long as something is either legal or illegal. Okay, there's always the gray areas. For that, you get a good accountant and they'll save you some money on your taxes. But in general, is legal and illegal. When it comes to the Torah law is interesting, because Torah law, we're interested in the law, but it's not just law. We're also interested in morality. So now the question is, morality, could you enforce morality? Could you enforce people to do the moral thing, the right thing? Or do you say, no, I'm just going to force people to do the legal thing. Whether or not they choose to do the moral thing, that's up to them. So that's the two ways of looking at it. Now, in general, we say the law is interested in telling you what to do. And if you want to go beyond the letter of the law, that's up to you. If you want to go more, do more, that's up to you. That's the general rule. But like every general rule, there are exceptions. There are specific categories of cases where the Talmud would say, even though you have no legal responsibility to do so, but because there is a moral issue at stake, the court will force you to do the moral thing, which is an exception to the rule. Usually the court does not enforce the moral. The whole idea of the moral is that it's up to you. It's up to you whether or not you want to do it. You know, that makes it a moral decision as opposed to a legal decision. But there are exceptions. And there's a few exceptions, and the Talmud has a few exceptions for individuals. But here, what's interesting about this case, it's a class of law. This becomes the law for everybody, regardless of the individual. And we're going to tell you that you must do this. The court could enforce it. Now, where does the Talmud pick up this authority to enforce a moral question? So there is a verse in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, that says, "V'asisa hayashar v'hatov," do what's good and upright in the eyes of Hashem. So the Talmud says, look, this is telling you that you have to do what's upright and what's good. In other words, it's not a legal obligation, but it's a moral obligation. And the Torah says you have to do it. So if the Torah says you have to do it, that means that in certain circumstances, the Talmud is the court is supposed to impose the doing of what's good and what's upright. And that's the introduction, the philosophical underpinnings for what we're about to do. We're about to do something unusual. We're about to talk about laws where we will enforce something that is a moral benefit, a moral right, even though it's not a legal right. Now, once we give the principle, there's going to be many, many exceptions. And the exceptions fine-tune the law, right? Because then you see what the Torah is trying to get at with the rabbis. I should really say the rabbis, because this is a sort of a rabbinic law. The rabbis instituted this concept, and they say we're going to enforce it because the Torah gives us the authority to do so and responsibility to do so by saying that sometimes we can enforce doing what is good and what is upright. Okay, what's the case? I'm beating around the bush here, trying to buy time. What's the case? The case is called the Dina de Bar Metzra, which is Aramaic for the law of the neighbor. And there is a similar concept in secular law, but it's very different than the Talmudic law. So in secular law, it's called the right of first refusal. So I could make a contract with my neighbor that when I'm going to sell my home, they have the right they have the first right to buy the home, and I can't sell it to anybody else without their permission. In other words, without first offering it to them, and only if they reject the offer, if they don't want to buy it, then I'm allowed to. Then I can go and sell it to somebody else. So that's the right of first refusal. You have it sometimes contractually. People can make the contract. Sometimes it's if you're buying within a lot that has a covenant. Sometimes the neighborhood makes this is part of the covenant of the title. In any case, it has to be agreed upon. But in the Torah, the law is much broader. In the Torah, the law is that if I want to sell my home and I sell it to somebody else, the neighbor has the right to step in and buy it from the buyer for the price that the buyer paid. Why? The principle is you have to do what's good and upright. What's the principle? The principle is that I'm living here. I'm sorry. Let's say I'm the neighbor. The neighbor is living here. The neighbor wants to expand. The neighbor has been waiting for decades to be able to expand. All of a sudden, this lot opens up and someone who's a foreigner, who's a stranger to this neighborhood comes in. Now we tell that foreigner, you can go buy land anywhere you want. For you buying on this street, on that street, on Millbank Avenue, on Mason Street, Greenwich Avenue, it's all the same, right? For me, I have a house here. So there's only one place where I can extend my house into. It's true about homes, but it's also true about farms, about farmland. So I have a field. If I have two fields that are in two separate places, then the cost of plowing and the cost of doing labor and the cost of planting and harvesting, the cost goes up because I have two locations. So it's good for me to have one location. Meanwhile, the person buying into the neighborhood, that person, we say for him, it makes no difference where he buys his field, this field or that field. And therefore we say to do what's good and upright, one should allow, one has to allow the neighbor to come in and buy it off the buyer for the price the buyer bought. Now, some people this law makes them uncomfortable. Some people get upset about this law, but we'll have to, again, we're going to fine tune it and talk about the specific cases where it applies and where it doesn't apply. But the principle is, again, we tell the buyer that's coming into town, we say, for you, doesn't make a difference this lot or the other lot. For the neighbor, it's much more important, it's much more valuable to buy this area. It's good for him. So we want to do what's good and upright and protect the neighbor. That is the principle of Bar Metzra, which literally means the Metzra is a border, the son of the border, the master of the border, as opposed to the secular concept of right of first refusal, which is specifically by contract, as opposed to here, which is, so even if there's no contract, I have the right to buy the neighboring land from the buyer for the price that the buyer paid to get it. So this is the principle. Now we're going to see where we got it from, and we're going to see it. How do we apply it? Okay.
Rabbi, I just sent you a text.
Yeah. So Neil Grant wants to know: shouldn't there be a bidding war so the seller can get the best price? That's the question that all the economists want to know. You may be protecting the neighbor, but you may be harming the owner of the home, right? I'm the seller, right? We have three parties here. We have the seller, we have the buyer, and we have the neighbor. So we seem to be protecting the neighbor at the expense of the buyer. That's certain. The question is, are we protecting the neighbor at the expense of the? Are we protecting the neighbor at the expense of the home of the seller? That's the question. Now, because I'm not an economist, I can't answer that question 100%. But once we read all the exceptions to the rule, this concern may be alleviated at least somewhat. So, for example, there's an exception that would say as follows. Let's say I'm the seller and I want a bidding war. So I go to my neighbor and I say, look, I'm selling it to you for this amount of money. Would you buy it for me? Are you willing to buy it for this amount of money? And if the neighbor says no, then I can go and I can sell it to somebody else. In other words, there are specific cases. In other words, it's not like the neighbor could just sit on his hands and decide to just come in and buy it for any price. I could put pressure on the neighbor by telling the neighbor, if you don't buy it for me at this price, I'm going to sell it to somebody else. And if the neighbor does not agree does not buy it for that price, then he loses the right to buy of first refusal. He loses the right to buy into the property. So I think the answer is that the homeowner is losing a little bit, but it's not like there's no pressure at all upon the neighbor to buy, because I could approach my neighbor, say, look, I'm selling the house for $1 million. Do you want to take it or leave it? If he says I'm not taking it, then I can go and sell it to somebody else for that money or more. So I think that there's going to be some pressure on the buyer, on the neighbor as well, to come in with a better offer. That's one angle. Another angle is, let's say you're the buyer, okay? You want to come into this neighborhood. That's what you want to do. So you know of this right of first refusal. So now you have incentive to overpay for this house, right? Why do you have incentive to overpay for the house? So that the neighbor shouldn't buy you out, because the neighbor is going to buy you out at the price you bought. So let's say I'm sitting on a house on Greenwich Avenue or Millbank Avenue that's worth $1 million. My neighbor, a buyer, wants to get into town, so he's going to come in and pay $1.1 million. He's paying an extra $100,000. Why is he paying an extra $100,000? Because he doesn't want my neighbor to buy him out. The neighbor's not going to buy him out for $1.1 million, because the neighbor doesn't want to overpay. So in other words, I'm not so sure. Again, I'm not an economist. I can't guarantee you who's winning and who's losing here, but there still is going to be pressure I don't know how much I'm sure it impacts the homeowner's ability to get the highest price in some ways, but in other ways, this law may also actually benefit the homeowner and give him more money. So I'm not sure exactly how much he's losing. But again, we're not necessarily saying that the homeowner is not losing. It's possible that the homeowner is, just like the buyer is losing right to move in. But we're trying to look at everybody's interests here. We have three parties. We have the neighbor, we have the homeowner, and we have the buyer. And we want to say who stands to lose the most. And the Talmud seems to be saying that the neighbor stands to lose the most, because the neighbor only has a neighbor, right? He can't go anywhere else. If he wants to have his fields together or his homes together, he has very little option. So if he cannot step in and buy the plot next to him, he stands to lose the most. So I hope this at least alleviates your concern a little bit, Neil.
Question, Rabbi?
Yes.
If something of moral nature is enforceable by law, then isn't it by definition a law?
Yes, but again, that's a good question. Is it just semantics? The law is, what is the law? The law is how a society expresses its values, right? So the society gets together and said stealing is wrong. We all agree stealing is wrong. It's wrong. What does morality mean? Morality means society says it's not wrong, but we're giving you space. We're giving you an area where you can go beyond the letter of the law. If you choose to do something nice, even though you don't have to, it's a wonderful thing. Okay, fine. That's the sort of the educational perspective. Now we're saying like this: we're going to take one law or one class of laws that we're going to define as morality. In other words, we say that it's not the law in the sense that legally you don't. In other words, if you want to talk about right and wrong, you don't have. This doesn't fall into the category of right or wrong. So when society takes one law, when the rabbis take one law and say this is a moral law, it's not a legal law, but we're going to enforce it. So Mark says, what's the difference? What's the difference? How you classify it? So we say there's an educational difference, because by saying it's not a law, you don't have a legal obligation. but you have a moral obligation, and this moral obligation is so powerful that in some cases we're going to enforce it. What you're telling the people is that don't get stuck in questions of is it legal or not, right? You're forcing people, at least in certain circumstances, to ask the question, not is it legal or not, but you're asking is it moral or not. In other words, since by taking one case and saying we're going to force you to do something that is not a legal obligation, there's no practical difference between that and the law, but there's an educational difference because you're telling people there's no legal obligation, there is a moral obligation. A moral obligation is so important that you actually should have to do it in certain cases. And that helps people think about life, expand the concept of obligation from law to morality. So let me give you an example. Let's say I'm running for the mayor of Greenwich, right? So let's say the press finds that I did something morally wrong, right? So I'm going to have a problem running for the office. What happens if it's not, if I did something legally wrong? What happens if it's not legally wrong, right? I say, look, the law backs me up. The law says I don't have to do it. So people are going to say, okay, so that one society would say, you didn't break the law. You followed the letter of the law. You took advantage of every loophole on your taxes, but you followed the letter of the law. You're a good citizen, right? Because morality is nobody's business, right? Here the Torah is saying, 1 second. Morality, just because we don't enforce it, it is still society's business, and it is still a reflection of what type of person you are. And to make that point, once in a while, there's one class of cases we're going to say, no, we're going to force you to do what's moral because morality is important. So in that sense, again, I agree with you that there is no practical difference between saying you're enforcing something that is a moral obligation and not a legal obligation. But I think there's an educational difference, and and really the law is about the education. It's about conveying values. So I think therefore that it is indeed significant. Okay, if we had enough of the introduction, we can read some of the words of the Talmud. I'll see. Okay, let's read a little bit of the Talmud, and then we'll see how much. Let me see what's happening here. Okay, I think I'm sharing a document here. I'm going to scroll down to the English. I'm going to try, and here we go. Okay, this is an interesting case. This is a case where it's similar in the sense that we're going to get involved in asking the question of, can I take possession of land that neighbors other lands? But it could be that this is an exception because this is not the real law of the neighboring of the neighbor, as we will explain. So I'll read a few lines inside, and then I'll try to explain. So here we go. I'm going to try to point. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, one who takes possession of land that is located between the land of brothers or between the land of partners and causes them trouble is impudent. I don't know what impudent means, but in Hebrew, he's chatzifa. He has chutzpah. Okay? As for removing him, we do not remove him, as they have no real claim against him. Rav Nachman said, we even go as far as to remove him, as one should not do anything that harms another. And if the complaint against him is due to the halacha of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor, as they own fields bordering on this one, we do not remove him. The sages of Naharda say, even if his claim was due to the halacha of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor, we still remove him, as it is stated, and you shall do that which is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. Deuteronomy 6:18. One should not perform an action that is not right and good, even if he is legally entitled to do so. Okay, what's happening here? Why there's so many words? Why there's so many cases? So there's really a few steps here. So let me give you an example of let's talk about this for a second. Let's go back to the right of first refusal, the law of the neighbor, and see what happens. So let's say, for whatever reason, again, we have three parties. We have the homeowner, we have the neighbor, and we have the buyer. So let's change the case a little bit. It's not that I sell it to a homeowner. It's not that I decide to sell my house. It's not that the homeowner decides to sell his house to a neighbor. I'm sorry, to a stranger. It's not like the homeowner decides to sell the home to a stranger, but let's amend the case. What happens if I decide to gift it to somebody else? So Mark is my friend. I say, I'm gifting my house to you. My neighbor says, 1 second, I've been waiting for decades to take possession of this land. Mark, I'm going to pay you for the value of the house and go buy yourself another house. So the law is, we'll see it later, that a matana, a gift, the concept of the law of the neighbor does not apply to a gift. Okay, so I can gift my land to somebody else and the neighbor cannot take it away from them. What is the rationale? The rationale of that law is that usually the reason why I could say to the buyer, the neighbor could tell the buyer to go somewhere else, is because the neighbor could tell the buyer, you want to buy land? Go buy a different piece of land. But that reasoning does not apply to a gift. Why not? Because by a gift, what are you going to tell the guy? Go find a gift somewhere else? Nobody else is giving out gifts, right? So it doesn't apply to the concept of gifts, right? So if I'm going to sell my land and the guy wants to come and buy land, so my neighbor says, look, buyer, there's 10 houses for sale. Right now in Greenwich, there's 500 houses for sale. Go buy a land. Well, go buy another house. What's the problem? But if I'm gifting it to somebody, if the homeowner is gifting it, we cannot tell the recipient of the gift, go find a gift somewhere else. It doesn't make sense. How could you find a gift somewhere else? So it doesn't apply to a gift. And here's another case where it doesn't apply. It doesn't apply to a case which is similar to a gift, but what they call hefker. If for whatever reason, don't ask me why, I'm the homeowner and I say I am disowning my house becomes hefker. Hefker means it legally belongs to everybody or nobody, depending on who you ask. There's two opinions of what hefker is, right? When we burn the chametz, we declare that all chametz that we own is hefker, is ownerless, right? So there's a halachic concept of saying something, it was mine, it was in my possession, no longer so, now it's ownerless, anyone could take possession. So I wake up in the morning and I say, my house is now ownerless. Some stranger living in the next town shows up and takes possession of the home. The neighbor cannot get rid of this new person from the other town who took possession of my ownerless home. Why not? Because again, it only applies to a sale, because we could tell the buyer, go buy a house somewhere else. But taking hefker doesn't apply to hefker, to ownerless land, because what are you going to tell them? Go find other land that's ownerless? There is no other land that's ownerless available. So that's why there are exceptions to this law of the right of the law of the neighbor. So the Talmud begins with cases that is not a sale, right? Let's go back and let's revisit this, and then we'll open it up for, I guess you could still ask questions if anybody wants to ask. Let's revisit this. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, one who takes possession of land that is located between the land of brothers or between the land of partners, right? He takes possession of land. It doesn't say he owned it. It doesn't say he bought it. It says he takes possession. So the commentaries say we're talking about a case that there was land that was ownerless, and this person comes and takes possession. What is land that is ownerless? There are different opinions of how this would play out. One opinion is that the government would basically say, would tax all the lots, and somebody is not paying taxes, so the government would say, whoever wants to take possession of this land can take possession as long as you pay the tax. Okay, so in that sense, there's a plot here that's between two brothers, or a plot between two partners, and that plot will belong to somebody else. But now it's ownerless, right? All you have, because it's ownerless. So it's basically it's a find, right? If I'm a stranger and I find this land, I come in, I take possession. All I have to do is pay the tax, and I get free land. If I do this, the law of the right of first refusal the law of the neighbor doesn't necessarily apply, and that's what Rabbi Yehuda says. He says, I have chutzpah because I stepped in between two brothers or between two neighbors, but this is not the law of the right of first refusal. Others say, no, it is the right of first refusal. In other words, this is the law of the neighbor. You could expel the neighbor in this case. So it's not so clear. In other words, I'm sorry. Yeah, even in this case, there's a debate whether you can expel them. But then the next case is what happens if it's a case of neighbors. In other words, it's a case of a sale. The sages, even if it's a claim was due to the halacha of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor, which is a sale, we still remove him as it is stated, and you shall do what is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. So the conclusion of this discussion here is that some cases it may not, the court may not, it's debatable, actually in all cases it's debatable, but there's one class of cases where the court won't expel the intruder, but they will label him as someone with chutzpah, meaning you're not doing the right thing, but we're not going to remove you. Whereas there are other cases where we will indeed remove the person because it's the law of the bar metzra, the law of the neighbor. In other words, in the case of a sale, that too was up to debate between Rav Nachman says we don't remove him, but Nahar Da'a. Nahar Da'a was a city in Babylonia, a famous city in Babylonia. There was a yeshiva Nahar Da'a. The sages of Nahar Da'a say no, they're the ones who take this law of the neighbor to the extreme, and they say if you're going to come in and buy land between two neighbors or between two partners or between two brothers, the neighbor, the brother, the partner, again, provide brother and the partner as a neighbor, they can make you leave by reimbursing the money of the sale because of the mitzvah, v'asisa yasher v'atoiv. You have to do what is just and right in the eyes of God, and in this case, we define this as something that is just and right. So this is a few lines of the Talmud, and of course we could continue. We still have a few minutes, but it looks like looks like we lost Neil, which is fine, which is good. Not good. Good. He has to go for other things. Good. Okay, that's for that. If all is clear, we could continue. Now it gets interesting. Again, we're still trying to clarify. In the beginning, we're going to mention laws that protect the neighbor. Later in the page, we start listing the laws that protect the buyer. In other words, we start limiting the law. Now we're still expanding the law. So here's this. This is actually an interesting case. We're going to show how powerful the neighbor's right to the neighboring land is. Here is a case. Here is an interesting case. The Gemara asks, if the stranger came to consult with one of the owners of the fields, in other words, the stranger consults with the neighbor and said to him, shall I go and acquire the field? And the latter said to him, go and acquire it, as I will raise no objections. Right? So this stranger, we call him the stranger. The stranger means the potential buyer wants to move into this neighborhood. So he comes to the neighbor and he says, look, Mr. Neighbor, I want to buy the land. Are you going to object? The guy says, I'm not going to object. Now, what does that mean? Does that promise, do those words have the force of law or not? So the question is it necessary to perform an act of acquisition with him to solidify the agreement, or perhaps his mere promise is sufficient and is not necessary? So usually if I own something and I say I'm going to give a legal right, a possession or a legal right, I'm going to give it to Mark. I don't really have to do it. Legally, you can't force me to give it to you, right? I get up and I say, I'm going to give you a gift. Do I have to do it? No. If, however, I make a formal act of acquisition, what the Talmud calls a kinyan, an act of acquisition, then I have an obligation, a legal obligation to give it to you. Anytime you want to do something, you want to do a legal transaction in halacha, you have to make a formal act of acquisition. You do so when you sell the chametz to the rabbi. If you're not doing it online, if you're doing it online, then clicking OK is the formal act of acquisition. But if you're going into the rabbi, usually there's this process where you lift up a garment, and that's the formal act of acquisition. We just celebrated the engagement party of Menachem Darren, and there it's not really a legal engagement, but they both bride and groom have to commit that they're going to show up to the wedding, right? They're not going to run away, make a legal commitment. They pick up a garment and they say, this is a kinyan, I'm making a commitment, a legal act of commitment that I am going to do so and so. So here the question is, the stranger comes to the neighbor and says, neighbor, I want to buy the house next door. Can I buy it? Are you going to protest? In some ways, what he's asking is, could you give up your right of the neighbor stepping in? The neighbor says, yeah, no problem, you can go and buy it. The question is, does he have to make an act of acquisition? What I think is at stake here, is the question is it really, how much of a right does the neighbor have in the land of the neighbor? In other words, if you say you don't have to make an act of acquisition, you're basically saying the neighbor doesn't really have a real right here. Because if you had a right, then to give up a right, you need a formal act of acquisition, right? So the debate between the two rabbis of whether or not you have to make an act of acquisition is really a debate of how much the neighbor has a right, has an ownership right in the plot of his neighbor. So we had this two opinions. And remember that Nahardai, that the people of Naharda were the ones who first introduced the right of first refusal, the law of the neighbor, and they said that you could enforce the law, the right of the neighbor. And here too, the sages of the Naharda say it is necessary to perform an act of acquisition with him. So we have a consistent thread. The rabbis of Naharda, they really believe this concept that the neighbor has a right, has certain ownership rights in the neighboring plots. And therefore, even if the neighbor says to the stranger, go ahead and buy it, that's not enough for them to lose their right. To lose their right, they would have to engage in a formal act of acquisition. And the Gemara concludes, and the halacha is that it is necessary to perform an act of acquisition with him. So we see the Gemara takes the position of the law of the people of Naharda, which is the extreme. In other words, the people who take this law to the extreme, they say literally the neighbor really owns has a legal right because of the concept of to do good. That gives them a certain right in a certain ownership stake in the neighboring plot, and therefore to give up this stake of ownership, they would have to make a formal act of acquisition. Okay, so I think we have enough Talmud. We could talk a little bit about the philosophy of the law for a moment or two. We know that people know of the concept of bashert. What is bashert? Bashert is that before, I don't know what bashert is. That's a good question. I have no idea. But what it's based upon, it's based upon that the Talmud says that before the soul is born, before the soul descends into the body, there's a voice that emerges in heaven, and the voice says that this soul is going to be married to that soul. Bas plani l'plani, this person's daughter to this person. That's actually relatively famous. Everyone heard of bashert. Some even have heard of the Talmudic phrase that bashert is based upon. But what people don't always know is that same Talmudic concept continues, and it says not just this person will marry this person, but also it says that this field will belong to this person. In other words, bashert is not just the person you're going to marry, but it's also the real estate that you're going to own. Right? So if you happen to own real estate on Park Avenue instead of Madison Avenue, it's not by mistake. It's not just because that's the time you decided to step into the market, but it actually is bashert, right? So from the mystical perspective, what they're saying, what the mystics believe is that just like you have a soulmate, in other words, there's a connection between your soul and the soul of your spouse. There is also a connection between you and your possessions. Because what is possessions? Possessions are physical objects that have a spark of God within them. And if you own this possession, it means that your soul's mission on earth is to interact with this spark and elevate it to holiness. Okay? So if I own this field or if I own this house, I have to sanctify this field and this house, and I have to do it, not somebody else. Now, if it happens to be that I have to sell it in 10 years, it's because I have a certain portion of the energy of this field, and my neighbor has a certain portion of, and the future buyer has a certain portion of energy in this field. Okay, so now let's revisit the law of the Bar Metzra. What the Talmud is telling us, just like we know when it comes to the laws of tzedakah, for example, that even though you have a responsibility for everybody, but the poor people of your city are first, meaning to say the closer the circle is to yourself, the more responsibility you have. You have first responsibility to your family, and then to your neighbors, and then to the people of your city, and then to the rest of the world, because it's sort of the circles. And the closer the circle is to you, the more responsible you are. So similarly, it happens with real estate. If I own real estate on this street, meaning my soul is connected to this land, and we know that the Kabbalists and the Hasidic masters understood that when you do a mitzvah in a certain area, you're elevating the spark of that area. They would say that there's no such thing of going somewhere by mistake. If I made a wrong turn and I ended up on a street that nobody has ever been on, it's because I have to do something holy here because there's a spark here connected to me. So in that sense, if I live here, I have a spiritual responsibility for the sparks in this area. But then there's also, I have sort of quote unquote ownership rights. My soul is also related to the neighboring plots. And therefore, if something, the land becomes available and I have the cash in the bank, that could be God telling me, here is the time, here is the space, take possession of this land. So in other words, from the Hasidic perspective, and it's back to, and it's really the philosophy behind the law, if I'm in a certain place, it's not by mistake. If I'm in a certain place, it's because I have spiritual roots and spiritual connection to this place. So here, what I said is a little bit of Kabbalah, but it's also in the Talmud, because the Talmud is the one that says that it's destined. Before my soul enters this earth, there's an announcement saying this field belongs to this person. Now, we just touched the surface of this law. We learned a few lines. There's a page and a half of Talmud on this. Maybe next month, lunch and learn. I'm sorry there was no lunch. I hope there was a little bit of learning. But maybe next time we get together, we'll have some sushi and we'll continue this subject. Maybe we'll go to another subject. No guarantees, but there's still a lot to learn on this topic. The limitations of this law, when it applies, when it doesn't apply. And that's it for now. I hope you had as much fun as I did.
Beautiful.
Thank you.